Marcus sets his alarm for 4:47 a.m. Not because he wants to, but because if he doesn't, the warehouse docks his pay instantly. He hasn't had a single day off in 11 days. Not a morning to sleep in, not an afternoon to spend with his kids. And not a single evening where his body isn't still vibrating from the hum of heavy machinery. At this point, Marcus isn't living as a man anymore. Instead, he has become a mere unit of output. He is a biological machine that the system runs until it breaks and then casually replaces. But here is the most terrifying part. Marcus doesn't think this is wrong, and nobody around him does either. Because in the world Marcus lives in, the cultural memory of a day that belongs to no one has been completely erased. There is no hour that cannot be monetized, and no morning that isn't already owned by someone with a spreadsheet. The entire idea that rest is a fundamental right, not a reward, not a luxury, and not something you have to earn with your sweat and blood, simply does not exist. It was never passed down. It never became law. It never became culture. And the reason it was never transmitted is because one specific event was quietly wiped from human history. A Sunday morning. An empty tomb. A single moment that, whether you believe the theology behind it or not, sparked a massive chain reaction. A reaction that would eventually give every working human being on earth a day that the market could not touch. Today, we're going to erase that morning. And then, we're going to watch what the world becomes without it. Let's go back to the year 33 AD. The world at that time operated on a simple, brutal rule. You worked until you couldn't, and then someone else decided when you were allowed to stop. The Roman economy was never subtle about what it thought human beings were for. If you were a slave, and roughly 1 in 3 people on the Italian peninsula were, your time was not yours in any legal or philosophical sense. It belonged to your owner, the way a cart belongs to a farmer. You didn't rest because your body needed it. You rested only when the cart needed to be parked so it wouldn't break down. Freedmen fared slightly better, but only marginally. Laborers in the grain trade, construction yards, compe, and textile workshops all moved to the relentless rhythm of the market, not the natural rhythm of the human body. There was no institutionalized pause and no architecture of protected time. The idea that a day could belong to no one, meaning that the economy itself could be forced to stop, wasn't just a radical political position. It wasn't even a conversation. It was simply unthinkable. The Romans did have a word for leisure, otium, but otium was never meant for the masses. It was the exclusive privilege of the elite, like the senator who could afford to philosophize, or the wealthy landowner who could step away from commerce. For everyone below that class, time off wasn't a right. It was just a brief gap between demands. Into this deeply unforgiving world came a microscopic anomaly. A tiny Jewish sect operating out of Jerusalem, Humutimo, a city Rome had already crushed once and would inevitably crush again, was suddenly making a claim that the imperial economy had no framework to process. It wasn't a political rebellion or a military threat. It was a claim about time itself. It was a claim about what a single day each week meant for a human being, regardless of their legal status, your social class, or your productivity value to the state. Now, the Jewish Sabbath already encoded this idea within its oldest legal texts. But at the time, it was tribal and bounded. Ku, meaning it applied only to one specific people inside one specific covenant. What the resurrection event did, historically and sociologically, regardless of what you personally believe happened in that tomb, was detach that revolutionary idea from its ethnic container. It injected it into a missionary religion with no geographic ceiling. A religion that within just 3 centuries would become the official ideology of the very empire that once believed odium was only meant for senators. That is the first domino. The force behind this transmission isn't just theology, it is institutional momentum. A core principle that human beings possess an inherent right to collective rest that no economic system can permanently override traveled from a first-century Jewish legal code through the resurrection narrative straight into the Roman Empire's official calendar, and eventually into every single labor protection statute your government has ever passed. That chain has remained unbroken for millennia, but today we break it. Here is where the timeline fractures. The morning after the Sabbath, the tomb is checked. The body is still there, completely undisturbed. Whatever rumors might have started, they die out instantly. The guards hold their post. The seal remains intact. And the small, terrified group of followers who had staked everything on a man they believed was something more than mortal, quietly scatters. They don't collapse in a dramatic showdown. They fade away silently, the way all movements die when their central claim crumbles under the weight of a single, undeniable fact. Within a decade, the sect is unrecognizable. Some return to their local synagogues. Others drift into the general population of Roman Judea, carrying nothing distinctive enough to survive the next generation. A few try to keep the teachings alive, such as the ethics, the beautiful stories, and the parables about how the powerful should treat the powerless. But without the resurrection as the load-bearing event, there is no missionary engine. There is no Paul on the road to Damascus, because there is no explosive catalyst to knock a Roman citizen off his horse and redirect his brilliant organizational genius toward building transnational communities of belief. There is no Gospel of Mark written in urgent prose for a Roman audience. There is no Book of Acts mapping the spread of an idea across the Mediterranean like a perfectly executed logistical campaign. The movement folds back completely into Judaism, and Judaism, for all its moral and legal sophistication, is a bounded system. The Sabbath stays, of course. The principle of collective rest, 1 day in 7, protected and non-negotiable, remains alive and precise inside Jewish communities across the diaspora. But it does not travel. It has no vehicle. The vast missionary architecture that would have carried this concept beyond its ethnic borders into Greek households, Roman garrison towns, North African trading ports, influenda, and eventually into the legislative chambers of empires. That architecture is never built. Because the event that would have justified building it never happened, Rome notices absolutely nothing. And why would it? A minor sectarian dispute in an occupied province resolved itself without violence. The empire has much bigger problems to worry about. And so, the great extraction machine keeps running. Butterfly effect. From that single fracture, the timeline begins to shift. Not with a sudden bang, but with a deafening silence, which is the silence of an idea that never left the room it was born in. The 1st century passes without incident. Rome doesn't miss what it never lost. The 7-day week still exists. It has, for centuries, borrowed from Babylonian astronomy and mapped onto planetary names. But it remains a navigational tool, not a social contract. There is no institution with the reach, the motivation, or the theological framework to declare one of those 7 days permanently off limits to the market. The Jewish communities keep their Sabbath quietly and internally, and the empire keeps its schedule, which means everyone works, always. By the 2nd century, the pattern is permanently locked in. Roman laborers, whether slave, freed, or contracted, operate on a rhythm dictated entirely by agricultural seasons, construction deadlines, and the sheer appetite of whoever owns the operation. Rest only happens when the work is completely finished, when the body physically fails, or when a public festival interrupts the calendar. Festivals do exist, as Rome has dozens of them. But they are not weekly, they are never guaranteed, and they do not belong to the worker. They belong to the state, to the gods of the state, and to the political machinery that uses public celebration as a pressure valve to keep the masses compliant. A festival is a gift handed down by power. What never develops, the exact concept that was on the very verge of forming in that tiny Jerusalem sect before it collapsed, is the idea that rest is a right that power cannot revoke. Consequently, Constantine's famous edict of 321 AD never happens. In our real timeline, that edict, issued by a Roman emperor who had converted to Christianity, mandated that the 1st day of the week be an official public rest day across the entire empire. It was the first time in Western legal history that a government formally protected a recurring interval of non-labor for the general public. But in this timeline, Constantine has no Christianity to convert to. He remains a pragmatic politician worshiping Sol Invictus, and his calendar reforms reflect the needs of the military and the bureaucracy, not the sacred rhythms of a religious community that never consolidated. The 7-day week survives purely as administrative infrastructure. The protected day of rest is lost. As the medieval period arrives, it finds absolutely no counterweight to feudal exploitation. In the real timeline, the Catholic Church's fierce insistence on Sunday observance, however imperfectly enforced or corrupted by political alliances, acted as a vital friction point against a lord's total ownership of a serf's time. Parish priests recorded violations, and canon law created at least a theoretical ceiling on labor demands. Monastic schedules, which divided the day into precise rotations of prayer, work, and rest, quietly modeled a rhythm of human time that wasn't purely about production. That model eventually seeped into guild cultures, craft apprenticeships, and the earliest labor customs of medieval European towns. But none of that exists here. The feudal lord's schedule is the only schedule that matters, and it has no ceiling. By the time the Industrial Revolution hits, the infrastructure for worker resistance is not just weak, it is linguistically bankrupt. In our real timeline, the labor movement's fight for a 6-day and eventually a 5-day working week drew immense moral power from Sabbatarian language. It relied heavily on the argument, deeply embedded in Protestant culture, that rest was not laziness, but a sacred obligation to God. Factory owners who pushed 7-day schedules weren't just exploiting people economically. In the cultural framework of their workers, they were committing a profound moral crime. That language gave the labor movement a powerful vocabulary that resonated across strict class lines. It reached everyday people who would never have joined a union, but who went to church every week and knew, deep in their bones, that one day was supposed to be fundamentally different. If you strip that vocabulary out of history, the labor movement's argument becomes purely transactional. Rest is efficient. Rest improves factory output. Rest reduces mortality rates in the workforce. While all of that is true, none of it is as powerful as saying that rest is what you are owed as a human being, and no employer has the right to take it from you. That sentence has a rich history. In this timeline, it was never written. The 40-hour workweek arrives incredibly late, if it ever arrives at all. The weekend, which is that ordinary, unremarkable, invisible miracle of 2 consecutive days that belong entirely to you, is either never legislated or passed so narrowly and so late that multiple generations live and die without ever experiencing it. Marcus's grandfather worked 7 days a week. His father worked 7 days a week. Marcus sets his alarm for 4:47 a.m. on day 11, Mikashert, and he doesn't think this is wrong. Nobody around him does either. Because there is no cultural memory, no legal precedent. Tata umekia pudasheki puta. No religious echo, and no labor slogan borrowed from a preacher's sermon to tell him that this is not how life was supposed to be. The first domino was never tipped, and the world that fills the empty space it left behind looks almost exactly like our world today, except the alarm clock never stops ringing. Human impact. But a broken world isn't just about shifting maps or falling empires. It is about you. It's about your daily life, your mind, and your sanity. In this timeline, your nervous system has no socially legitimized permission to stop. That might sound abstract until you actually feel it. Especially that low-grade, constant hum of anxiety that never fully powers down. There is a lingering sense that stillness isn't rest, but failure. You might feel that a quiet Sunday morning isn't a gift, but a dangerous gap in your productivity that someone, somewhere is going to notice and punish. In the real world, we call that feeling burnout, and we treat it as a pathology, which is a harmful deviation from a healthy norm that includes recovery. But in this alternate timeline, that feeling is just called Tuesday and Wednesday and every other day of the week, none of which have names worth remembering because they are all exactly the same. The clinical concept of psychological recovery time never develops here. This is not because the science isn't there, but because the culture that would have demanded that science, the culture that encoded rest as a baseline human requirement, was never built. Your chronic anxiety wouldn't be classified as a disorder in this world. It would be the entirely correct neurological response to an environment that never agreed you were allowed to stop. Your home is no longer a sanctuary. It is simply the place where you are less productive than you would be at the worksite, but still not truly free. There is no shared morning, meaning no slow, quiet breakfast, and no hour where the people you love are in the same room without a clock already ticking down to the next shift. Relationships in this timeline are built entirely in the exhausting margins of life. You learn to love people in 15-minute intervals between grueling shifts. Warmth doesn't completely disappear, but it compresses. It becomes efficient. And an efficient warmth, sustained across years, eventually stops feeling like warmth at all. And your time, those precious hours between when one employer's claim on your body ends and another begins, has zero legal protection. The concept of being off-duty exists only informally, the way privacy existed before privacy laws, acting as a polite courtesy that power extends when it feels generous and revokes the second it doesn't. The boundary between being an employee and being a corporate asset was never drawn into law, because the law needed a foundation. The foundation was a protected day. The protected day needed a domino, and that domino required a Sunday morning in Jerusalem to go exactly the way it went in real history. Your weekend exists because of that very morning. It is not just because of politics, and not because of unions alone. It exists because one ancient transmission event carried a radical principle across 2,000 years and deposited it completely intact into the labor laws of the country you call home. But that dark timeline never happened. The domino fell exactly as it was meant to. And because that ancient chain reaction stayed firmly on track, your world today still makes sense. That isn't just luck. That is history. Real history. The tomb was empty. The claim spread. A frightened group of followers transformed into a massive missionary movement with no geographic ceiling. Paul wrote letters to young communities in Rome, in Corinth, in Ephesus, which were communities that gathered specifically on the first day of the week. They marked that day as inherently different, and they began the slow, monumental institutional process of encoding one interval in 7 as belonging to something other than the market. Constantine issued his edict. The medieval church, for all its undeniable flaws, held the line on Sunday as a protected interval against total feudal extraction. Sabbatarian preachers handed the labor movement a fierce moral vocabulary that factory owners couldn't simply dismiss as mere economics. And somewhere along that 2,000-year-old chain, a legislature in your country wrote a concrete law stating that your employer's claim on your body has a strict limit. That limit has a history. You are living inside it right now. Of course, it is worth noting, with minimal editorializing, that the ruling classes of every single era have been extraordinarily creative at finding theological justifications for why the protected day applied to everyone except the people who worked for them. So here's the question this episode leaves you with. The domino held for 2 millennia, but is it still holding today? The 40-hour workweek is rapidly eroding. The always-on, hyper-connected culture of digital work has quietly dissolved the boundary between employed time and personal time in ways that no modern labor law has fully caught up with. The sacred principle that your employer cannot own every single hour of your life was transmitted across 2,000 years and written into our statutes. But a principle encoded in law is not the same as a principle actively defended in practice. And the question of whether collective rest, as a structural human right, not just a corporate productivity strategy, survives the next 50 years is no longer a historical question. It is a live one. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Is our domino still standing? Or are we currently watching it wobble in slow motion?